but we didn't talk about it. Yeah, so let's do that. If I can get the screen to go up. Well, I can't, but I can just list them right here. I've got some markers. So we had our, on the top line, middle line, bottom line, this is how it should look at the end. Yeah, and what was the top line?
Judiciary Act of 1925.
And what was the significance of that?
Created
Certiorari. Created certiorari, and it represents the birth of the modern, right. So Judiciary Act, and we really should do it like this, because this is how, when you're talking about a public law, a Judiciary Act of 1925, and then on our 14th Amendment timeline, what was the case? Pierce versus Society of Sisters. And what was the significance of that?
Substantive due process.
It was the birth of the modern 14th Amendment, but what about substantive due process?
They was there to protect people.
Yeah, they started, instead of using substantive due process as a ploy or a creative way to protect corporations and businesses, which they had been doing for several decades, they suddenly took a very decisive turn and started to use substantive due process as a way to protect and create protections for people. And so the court really had, it was a breakthrough moment that made the 14th Amendment the way we think of it today, right? Because it's used, the 14th Amendment is a very important and powerful way to protect people's individual rights. So that was a real turning point there. And then 1925. So let's talk about on our First Amendment timeline. Gitlow versus New York. Now notice the litigants here, this is a person, and this is versus New York. So jump back here just one second. If you remember, this was the Society of Sisters. They're nuns, and they run schools, and this was all about forcing Catholics to send their children to public schools. So, and the people wanted to say, you're violating our constitutional rights by making us do this. And so you naturally would think, well, wait a minute, why is that on the 14th Amendment timeline instead of the First Amendment timeline? If it's about freedom of religion, why didn't they litigate that case? Or why couldn't they litigate that case as a First Amendment case? Right. Because at that point, if you're thinking in terms of very strictly reading the words of the First Amendment, remember we said, if you're going to litigate a First Amendment case, you got to have two elements present: Congress and a law made by Congress. And neither of those things was present. So they had to be creative in how they were going to litigate it. So they said, you're violating our 14th Amendment rights. And what clause did they go to? The Due Process Clause. And they seized on the word liberty, and the court agreed, and the court said, yes, liberty includes the freedom to educate your children as you so wish. You see how the court is using the word liberty as an empty vessel, and it's adding new freedoms and new protections into the word liberty. And so we said substantive due process is, somebody try to repeat the definition to me as precisely as possible.
the process of which the court has ruled or liberty.
And you might as well say in the due process clause to remind yourself where that is. It's the process by which the court adds new meaning to the word liberty in the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. And that's how the court creates new rights and protections for us. Now we get to Gitlow. And now you're looking at it and thinking, but Professor, you just said if Congress isn't involved and a law made by Congress isn't involved, it can't be litigated as a First Amendment case, and yet here we have a state level case. Aha. So the court was about to do something new. And at the time, radical. Flash your minds back and add this to your timeline on the top line. Add 1833.
The top line is a Supreme Court line, right?
The Supreme Court and general U.S. history.
Okay.
Yes, 1833. And there was a case, and it was called Barron v. Baltimore. And the question was put to the Supreme Court, do the amendments in the Bill of Rights apply only at the federal level, or can they also apply at the state level? And the Supreme Court said in no uncertain terms, the 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights only apply at the federal level and cannot apply at the state level until 1925. And we had this breakthrough moment where the court, and it's a funny decision to read, because when they get to this moment where they're about to apply the First Amendment at the state level and not just at the federal level, they just completely gloss over it. They just say at the beginning of one paragraph, it has long been understood that the Bill of Rights applies to the states. No footnote, no citation, no explanation, they just completely gloss over it. And so, here, they start the process, and this is another term for your notes, of incorporation. Incorporation. Incorporation is the process by which the court incorporates parts of the Bill of Rights into the word liberty in the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment in order to reach down to the state and local level.
Can you repeat that?
Incorporation is the process by which the court incorporates parts of the Bill of Rights into the word liberty in the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. And then here's the really important part, in order to reach down to the state and local level. Because think of it, picture the 14th Amendment if you happen to have your printout.
Yeah.
How does that incorporate the
Yeah. Incorporation is the process by which the court incorporates parts of the Bill of Rights into the word liberty in the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment in order to reach down to the state and local level. And whenever you're studying and you're reciting that, you have to do the hand. In order to reach down to the state and local level, because that's the important difference between substantive due process and incorporation. Substantive due process is when they add new rights to the word liberty, like the right to privacy. But incorporation, we already had those rights spelled out in the Bill of Rights. So why are they adding it to the word liberty? In order to reach down to the state and local level, because if you remember the words in the 14th Amendment, it says, no state shall abridge these freedoms. So you have to add the First Amendment into the 14th Amendment in order to reach down to the state and local level, and that's exactly what they do here. But they only did it one clause at a time. It took 6 separate cases to incorporate all of the First Amendment. This one, Gitlow, incorporated the speech clause. So just like here, where they said the word liberty also includes freedom to educate your children as you want, here they said the word liberty also includes freedom of speech, and we're applying it at the state level.
Okay, so I'm getting like slightly confused. So after 1925, so 1925 and on, now the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment can be taken to state and local levels. Or the 14th.
The idea of reaching the state level is only about incorporation. The 14th Amendment already reaches the state level, because remember the wording? It says no state shall. And this is an important visualization to help you. Remember we said we've got the federal government, we've got state governments, and we've got the individual. And before the 14th Amendment, we had the state standing as a buffer between the federal government and the state government. And then The 14th Amendment was the federal government inserting itself here, and it was telling the states what to do. So before 1925, so this is the federal government reaching down to the state and local level already with the 14th Amendment. Before 1925, the first 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights did not reach down to the state and local level. They only operated, picture this, remember we have 2 layers of government? Until 1925, the Bill of Rights only operated here. It only constrained the federal government. But from 1925 on, through the process of incorporation, the court would be imposing all of the constraints of the Bill of Rights onto the states as well. You see that?
So the 11th through 14th could they be taken to state and local levels as well? I know.
Well, they're about specific things. The 11th and 12th are about the structure of the federal government. So that wouldn't apply.
I guess what I just don't get is like how one day it can just go and violate something that was written.
Well, because, what do you call it? So we have Barron v. Baltimore of 1833. What did they do in Gitlow to that decision?
Is that so it said?
No, they overturned it.
Okay.
They overturned it. They basically said, even though they had, because you remember that was almost 100 years earlier,
Right.
and so they just overturned Barron v. Baltimore. Barron v. Baltimore no longer applies. And now the new rule created in Gitlow through the process of incorporation is that they're going to start applying all of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, to the states. It takes a long time. It takes all the way through 1969 because they have to do it one case at a time and one clause at a time. They didn't incorporate all of the Bill of Rights. The Second Amendment, they never did. The Second Amendment, they never incorporated in order to reach down to the state and local level. That's why you can have very different gun laws from state to state to state because they didn't incorporate the Second Amendment. But at this point, today, all of the clauses of the First Amendment, all 6 clauses, have been incorporated into the 14th Amendment, which means that the First Amendment applies at the state and local level. So remember, if you go back to the very first day when I told you that the word Congress in the First Amendment no longer means Congress, we said it means an agent or entity of government at any level. And it's because of this. You see that? And so just say, up until 1925, the Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment, only operated at the federal level, but from 1925 on, it also applies at the state and local level. Okay? So these are our 3 legal milestones of 1925.
Now, what exactly was happening in Gitlow, New York?
Somebody can Wikipedia that and see what the details were. We really don't care about the details of the case. And in fact, it's a disappointing case because the guy lost. The court still sided in favor of the government. They used, remember we said that the reason that certiorari was important was because the court, it increased the power and prestige of the court because the court could pick and choose its cases strategically. So this is a beautiful example of using cert. They only took this case because they wanted to use it as an occasion to change the law. They didn't care about Mr. Gitlow at all.
All it says is that he was a member of the Socialist Party and he was charged with criminal anarchy under New York's criminal law for publishing a document called Left Wing Manifesto.
Right. So it's, again, just like those 1919 cases, it was a matter of persecuting socialists for the things that they said and wrote. And notice that the court still sided with the government.
So, before like 1925, could a state charge somebody more than one time for the same crime because it was a state level?
That's right. So the 8th Amendment protection against double jeopardy did not apply at the state level. Bill of Rights only operates at the federal level. And it was actually not until 1969 in a case called, it also has B's in it. We'll have to think about it. While you're on Wikipedia, just do a search for incorporation and just throw in something like 8th Amendment. That was the last major case, in fact. It was in 1969, and they incorporated cruel and unusual punishment, Eighth Amendment.
Fifth, I think it's double jeopardy.
Fifth is double jeopardy. Because there's a Wikipedia entry on the incorporation process, and it shows each of the cases. I'll go there too.
Hurtado versus California, is that, or no, protection right against double jeopardy.
Yeah.
This right has been incorporated with Benton versus Maryland.
Benton versus Maryland in 1969. Yeah. And did you find a Wikipedia entry that
Yeah.
lays it all out?
Yeah, this is incorporation of the Bill of Rights.
Okay, let's look at it together. Because it'll help us picture how this is happening. All right, incorporation of the Bill of Rights. And it talks a bit about how all this worked. Notice it talks about Gitlow v. New York as the case that really set things going. And it talks here about due process interpretation, in other words, what we've been saying about using the word liberty. And then look, you see, so here's the First Amendment, and it tells you each of the cases in the year when each of the clauses was incorporated. We get Gitlow incorporates the speech clause, and then next week we'll talk about Neer v. Minnesota incorporated the press clause. Those are the two that are most important to us. And then it runs through all of the amendments. You see, it wasn't until, I forgot about this. It wasn't until 2010 that the Supreme Court finally got around to incorporating the Second Amendment. That was a big deal case. I forgot about that. Okay, so you see that we get the Certiorari Act. They increased their power and prestige by being able to pick and choose their cases. Here, how does when they use SDP to protect people rather than corporations, how does that play into the project of increasing their prestige
Because they're making themselves more credible to the people.
and more popular? And they're saying, no, we're not just big pro-business, we're pro-people too, and we want to protect people. So it endears the court to the people. The people, it becomes more popular. And then here in Gitlow, how does incorporating the Bill of Rights into the 14th Amendment in order to reach down to the state and local level, how does that play into Taft's project of increasing the power and prestige of the court?
Because as like the lower courts are trying cases about the First Amendment, they'll look to the Supreme Court. It's like they are like the body, so everyone will have to look to them.
Okay, and now a lot more courts are going to have to start looking to them because now the state level courts are going to have to start following what the Supreme Court says. And how else? If the Supreme Court was adjudicating Bill of Rights cases only on the federal level, and now suddenly they get to start doing cases on the state and local level too, it means that they can use their power of judicial review to strike down not just federal laws, but state laws too, and local laws too. So they're really increasing their reach, right? Okay, so let's go to our PowerPoint. All right. So your First Amendment, which you should all be practicing, and don't think of it, don't use the word memorize. It's not about memorizing. You say rehearse the law. You can just rehearse it, you know? And just, you can be walking to class and saying, Congress shall make no law. Or you can rehearse, I rehearse law while I'm driving. Or you can rehearse the law while you're in the shower. So just rehearse it. And you'll get it done. So freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the first thing that we have to look at case law over time to figure out, well, what is protected? And so, just like I said, Congress doesn't mean Congress anymore. It means any agent or entity of government at any level. The word speech doesn't mean just speech anymore. It means a lot of things. It doesn't mean just you're using your mouth to talk. Like, for example, so what we have to, the way to think about this is the speech-action dichotomy. So the threshold question in every First Amendment case is this speech, which is protected by the First Amendment, or is this action, which is not protected by the First Amendment? That's the threshold question in every case. And so, for example, if it's me standing here talking, then quite obviously it's literally speech. But what about this? What if I came in and I said, no, United States, I'm against you bombing Syria, and I lit an American flag on fire?
That's allowed.
Well, so then you're going to ask, my burning the flag, is it speech, which is protected, or is it action, which isn't protected? What do you think? Do you
Action.
think let's see, is it action that isn't protected,
Ac-
or is it speech that is protected?
Well, no, it's not, but you could argue it's speech.
Well, it is speech protected by the First Amendment because the Supreme Court said it was. Burning an American flag as a form of protest is protected by the First Amendment because the Supreme Court told us so in Texas v. Johnson. That's why we have to study cases over time to see what the court has said. What about this? What about if the city of High Point tries to close down a nudie club and the nudie dancers file a suit saying that our art form is artistic and expressive and therefore it is speech covered by the First Amendment? What do y'all think? Is nudie dancing speech covered by the First Amendment?
No.
The Supreme Court said no. The Supreme Court said no. What about this? What about let's say it was the Vietnam War or World War II or World War I, where there was a draft and it forced young men to go off and be killed, and you didn't want to go off and be killed, and so you had a protest, down with the draft, and you burned your draft card. Is burning a draft card speech that is protected by the First Amendment, or not speech, the action that isn't protected? Well, wait a minute, burning a flag, that was speech. But the Supreme Court said it's not protected. So that's why we have to study case. I know, it drives you nuts. It drives you nuts.
Maybe I'm the only one who's heard this before, or I guess it's a myth. Like, I've always heard that burning the flag was illegal. That's what I've heard. But
Burning a flag as an act of protest is perfectly legal and protected by the First Amendment.
So then what? How could like somebody who's just being a jerk saying, oh, I was protesting blah 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 issue?
That's why we have trials, so that the two sides can present their argument. And in Texas v. Johnson, the person who burnt the flag as a form of protest won, made the better argument. So that's why, yeah, we have two sides.
Is cursing the president and like is that
Highly
protected?
protected by the First Amendment.
Oh,
F you, President Obama. Very highly protected by the First Amendment.
okay.
Why do you think?
Freedom of speech.
You have to be able to vocalize how you feel about
And plus, we vote for him.
You have to be, the First Amendment above all protects your speech that is directed at the government. Because what's the last clause of the First Amendment? To petition the government for a redress of grievances. So we have got to be able to talk to our government, right? If you were Chinese, can you talk back to the Chinese government? No, they'd shoot you. So here the idea is we've got to have maximum freedom to talk back to the government. And criticizing the government is like the noblest act under the First Amendment. Criticizing the government is the noblest thing you can do in the eyes of the First Amendment. It's very important. So like I said, each case starts with this threshold question: is it speech or is it action? And once we determine whether it is speech that is protected by the First Amendment, and as we will see next week, there are varying levels of First Amendment protection. For whom or what are those rights protected? We'll talk next week when I introduce you to the stair-step method. I'll show you a visualization that I have developed called the stair-step method, so that you will see different types of speech are protected at different levels of protection. Different people, depending upon who they are. Like, you have much less speech protection than I do. You have much lower speech protection than students at UNC Chapel Hill, for example, and we'll talk about why that's so. Are these rights absolute? No. 3 bedrock principles of First Amendment law. Number 1, First Amendment protection is not absolute. First Amendment protection is not absolute. So, for example, the classic line from Holmes's decision in Schenck was that freedom of speech doesn't give you a right to shout fire in a crowded theater, right? That some speech can be punished. And that type of speech, go back to your timeline where you have the quartet of cases with Schenck. That type of speech is called incitement. Incitement. I-N-C-I-T-E-M-E-N-T. Incitement is a type of speech, and it's a perfect example of how First Amendment protection is not absolute. Example, incitement. I-N-C-I-T-E-M-E-N-T. Incitement is a type of speech that gets weaker First Amendment protection than, say, political speech, which gets very robust protection. But incitement is an example of how First Amendment protection is not absolute. You can be punished for incitement. And all the quartet of cases, all those cases are about incitement as a type of speech.
So an example of incitement would be like yelling fire.
Yeah, incitement is, speech that incites violence or lawless action. And all of those, the quartet of cases, what those people under the Sedition Act were being accused of was incitement. They were inciting violence and or the violent overthrow of government. And you'll see that more clearly in the visualizations, the stair-step visualizations next week. And then we talked about what incorporation is, and I gave you my precise definition for your notes. And we talked about Gitlow. Yeah, and here I've got a little bit of description of the case. And once again, we see that people are being punished. We see the government using the law to punish people for their political points of view. That's very different today, of course, as we'll see as the cases progress. And we talked about this. And we talked about the fact that even though they strategically used his case to start the incorporation process, they still sided with the government. So now we see the change is that the First Amendment now protects us from all levels of government. And then, why do you already know that this is true? It does not protect us against censorship by private entities. How do you know that that's true? And tell me what case it's from. You can't claim that a private person violated your First Amendment rights. Why not? What's the rule and what case? I'm coaching you on here's how you should study, here's how you should have it in your notes.
It has to be a government entity.
You have to have government involvement, and that rule is called State Action Doctrine, and it comes from Civil Rights Cases of 1883. That's how you gotta, when you're studying with your study partner, you quiz each other that way. You wanna put a rule with a case, and I hope a year. I think having the years on the timeline actually helps you remember it, because you visualize how the cases flow. And here, for note-taking purposes, I have given you that. And we said, what's our precise preferred definition that I gave you in class? Without government involvement, no constitutional claim can be made. That's important in First Amendment law because it means that the First Amendment doesn't reach private actors. You can't accuse her of violating the First Amendment rights because she's just a private person, right? Without government involvement, no constitutional claim can be made. That's important in First Amendment law because it means the First Amendment doesn't reach private actors. On this slide, simply, I did these years ago, and I have come up with my own method of teaching all this. Just write on here, see stair-step charts, and we're going to do those on Monday and Wednesday. There are 5 of them. And what it does is it takes all of that, all the input from the textbook, from chapters 2 and 3, especially chapter 3, and I found the textbook, it was confusing my students. And so I think the excerpt that I gave you was only about 6 pages, right? From chapter 3, it was real short. I'm going to teach you at the board a visual way of organizing all of that information. That's a lot easier. And again, we're going to talk about this. These are different types of speech, and we'll see this in detail on Monday and Wednesday. And so, back to the question about, cursing out the president or cursing about the president. It's political speech, and you can just reflect back on our conversation about the values of free expression. Remember on the handout? Which one would that be? Why, like, if you had to say, if I said to you, political speech is the most protected speech under the First Amendment, which one of those values would we be talking about? Participation in self-government. We're supposed to be a government of the people, for the people, and by the people, right? It doesn't feel like that some days. It doesn't feel like that when the vast majority of the public is against bombing Syria, and yet our administration seems determined to do that. But it's still supposed to be government of the people, for the people, by the people, and this is the way the First Amendment is our gateway, it's our avenue for participating in self-government. So political speech is highly, highly protected. Seditious libel or criticism of the government. Remember how on our timeline we had these repeated attempts by the government to pass laws to make it illegal to criticize the government? The Sedition Act of 1798. What was the next one? That was the Aliens and Sedition Act of 1798. The Sedition Act of 1861. And notice these are happening when there's a national crisis. So 1861, the Civil War, and then the Sedition Act of 1918 because of the First World War. And yeah, it was 1917, the Espionage Act, and then 1918, they added the Sedition Act. And as you'll see in 3 weeks, seditious libel, criticizing the government, cannot be a crime under the First Amendment. Although get this, you'll be surprised when we get here on the timeline. The Supreme Court did not say that until 1964. You even have a right to publish false or defamatory statements about government officials, as long as you don't publish those with knowledge of falsity or reckless disregard for the truth. That is called actual malice, and we will explore that in depth when we get to libel. Libel is an example of how First Amendment protection is not absolute. 3 bedrock principles of First Amendment law. Number 1, the First Amendment protection is not absolute, and the prime example of that is that you can get sued for libel. So, for example, the National Enquirer prints a story saying that Tom Cruise is gay. Tom Cruise sues for libel, and they can't just say freedom of the press because First Amendment protection is not absolute. And they lost. That's a real case. And they lost. And they had to pay him, I think, $5 million.
How did you prove that, if you had like actual malice, how did you prove that you didn't know anything about whatever you published? Like you published something against the government that's just completely a lie, and you couldn't prove, they couldn't prove that you actually knew about what the truth was or not.
That's why you then have a case, and you have a jury, and the jury gets to decide whether you showed knowledge of falsity or reckless disregard for the truth, right? So every legal dispute has two sides, and you're going to argue, I didn't have knowledge of falsity or reckless disregard for the truth. The government official is going to argue, yes, you did, and then the jury gets to decide based on the evidence. And we'll see that in depth when we get to libel. So, 3 bedrock principles of First Amendment law. Number 1, First Amendment protection is not absolute. Classic example, you can get sued for libel and have to pay someone damages. That's a perfect example of how it's not absolute.
But just saying, like, you can write something that is not true, or like.
Don't people already do that all the time?
Right, but as long as you don't know it's not true.
Yeah, you can say that you didn't know it wasn't true. You can have your ranty blog post about how Obama was born in Kenya and he's a Marxist and he's also a fascist at the same time. I love how people blend these things. It's like you can't be both at the same time. He's a Marxist and he's a fascist, and he was born in Kenya, and he didn't actually go to Harvard. That was made up by the CIA. And listen, you think I'm joking, but everything I say is out there in spades on the internet. And the First Amendment protects even the most, silly, revolting speech. Might as well add while you're making your list, second principle, bedrock principle, is the First Amendment is not a shield against laws of general applicability.
I have a question about being able to get sued. Edward Snowden, whenever he got sued for releasing the papers, the Guardian didn't get sued for publishing them, did they?
No. And he didn't get sued.
Well, he got arrested.
No, he's not arrested. His status right now is merely threatened and browbeaten by the American government. But no charges have been filed at all. Now there's an investigation underway. But we're going to come back to that when we talk next week about prior restraint. So hold that question and ask me that question again next week.
So what are we making a list of right now?
3 bedrock principles of First Amendment law. Number 1, First Amendment protection is not absolute. Number 2, the First Amendment is not a shield against laws of general applicability. What do you think a generally applicable law is? Just in your own words. Just interpret those words. A generally applicable law.
Like the speed limit or something?
Like a speed limit. Who does it apply to?
Everyone.
It applies to everybody, evenly across the board. A generally applicable law. You cannot run the red light and go 85 miles an hour, and then the cops stop you, and you say, I'm a reporter, freedom of the press. Right? It's not going to work. You're still going to get the $250 ticket. Right? You can't say you're doing a story and you're saying that, you're doing a story for the paper and you say that Nito Cobain is selling cocaine at his office. So you and another reporter go to Nito Cobain's house at 3 o'clock in the morning, and you sneak behind the house and you start going through the garbage looking for incriminating evidence. And all of a sudden, all the alarms go off and the cops show up and you get arrested and you can't say First Amendment. Right? What's that going to be? Trespass. And that is a generally applicable law. So the First Amendment does not protect anybody from generally applicable laws. And finally, freedom of speech and freedom of the press is a fundamental personal right, not an institutional one. Meaning, freedom of the press in the First Amendment applies to you and you and you and me and you. You don't have to be what you think of as a member of the press. a reporter for the New York Times, or a reporter for ABC News, or, you don't have to do that. You don't have to have a degree in journalism to be protected by freedom of the press.
Is
It's
that
a-
the third principle?
Freedom of the press is a fundamental personal right. What's that? That's a special phrase. What did we say? Fundamental personal right, as opposed to just a right. What's the difference? What's the difference between a right and a fundamental personal right? Which one is stronger? A fundamental personal right is the strongest type of right. It's a special type of right. Why is it special? Because it's actually specifically mentioned in the Constitution or Bill of Rights, right? So when we say freedom of the press and freedom of speech, because they are specifically mentioned in the Bill of Rights, so it's a fundamental personal right. Freedom of the press is a fundamental personal right, and the case that taught us that was Lavelle v. City of Griffin. You'll see that on our timeline later. So those are the three bedrock principles of First Amendment adjudication. The First Amendment is also the reason why you have absolute protection to have hate speech. Every ugly, awful thing you can think of is protected by the First Amendment.
Is this really in like politics or just
In general. In general. And remember we said, who came up with the theory to explain why it's good to protect hate speech instead of outlawing it?
Doesn't it give people a chance to put their opinion on it or something?
Even if it's a hateful, ugly
Yeah,
opinion,
so
put
that
their
they
opinion
can
out there.
judge it and determine stuff like that.
Yeah, and then others can judge it.
Yeah.
And
Lee,
No, it's I have it written down.
wasn't it kind of tolerant?
It's
Like the,
you should, it's on the handout,
yeah, I have
and we talked about it.
what's the question?
Because bullying
Oh, yeah.
is an action that isn't protected.
Yeah, if you let people use the language, it allows people to judge, and states that hate speech is good. People can
Because what happens is, it promotes tolerance. Lee Bollinger, it's down toward the bottom of the list, because as you say, go ahead and let people say those ugly things, and then society can judge whether they think that's okay or not. And it's a way that society people help teach each other what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable.
So you can't be incriminated for hate speech in general at all?
No. You can say whatever ugly thing
No,
you
it
want.
was like-
But now, of course, if somebody walked in here, yelling the N-word at the top of their lungs, I doubt anybody in here would say, yeah, that's acceptable. And so allowing people to go ahead and do that, it's especially, Bollinger's theory says it's especially important for young people to see how older people react to things like that so that they can learn what our norms, what our traditions are. That's not acceptable to say that.
So just something that always crossed my mind is that, in the Constitution Bill of Rights, they say, you have a free to assembly and petition and stuff like that. Yeah, all the time peaceful petitions are always broken up and people are oftentimes arrested for it.
It wasn't always that way. But see, in your lifetime, or in your adult lifetime, because you weren't watching the news and stuff when you were 4 or 5 years old, but in the past 10 years, our government at both the federal, state, and local level has a horrible track record in respecting people's right to assemble and right to petition the government for redress of grievances. When you look at, and next week when we're talking about prior restraints, I'm going to show you some video clips on YouTube about it. And we're talking about, First Amendment violations all over the place, left and right. And I was, Dan Cotter, who this video is being made for, his father is an attorney, and he and I had an interesting conversation when he was visiting about these Moral Monday protests. Those people are out there exercising their First Amendment rights, aren't they? They're peaceful, right? They're religious leaders and that sort of thing. And they're just holding up signs, and they're getting their heads cracked, right? They're getting arrested. So it wasn't always that way. That's why we have to be eternally vigilant in terms of protecting these rights. And so if you would think that, well, wait a minute, they have a really good case. They could sue that the government is violating their First Amendment rights. They really could. But why do you think they don't? It's a really good case. They have a good case. But why do you think they don't sue? It's expensive. It's expensive. And it would be hard for me to come up with $30,000 to try to pay, for litigation of a case like that. And it could drag on and on and on and get more expensive. So we have to protest then. We have to say, no, you're not going to, these people are peaceably assembling and you can't treat them that way. But it takes, again, it's like where instead of trying to use the law to solve the problem, sometimes society has to just do it itself. Like when we were talking about the hate speech. Instead of trying to use a law to stop hate speech, society itself has to do that. And if we see people's First Amendment rights being violated, it's up to all of us to speak out and say, no, that's wrong. You can't do that, government over in Raleigh, throwing all of these people in jail. Right? So we have to speak up about it. And then to the question about what about bullying online, you go to your speech-action dichotomy and you say, oh, bullying is action that is not protected by the First Amendment, right? Harassment is not speech that's protected by the First Amendment. Harassment is action that is not protected. And we talked about this, why does political speech get the highest level? And again, we'll talk about this next week when we talk about varying levels of First Amendment protection. But what you could note to yourself here, to be keeping in mind, since a lot of you are PR, advertising, marketing people, that's all a type of corporate speech, and it doesn't get the highest level of protection.
You mean like advertising?
Advertising, PR, marketing does not get the highest level of protection. What do you think the upshot of that is? If it doesn't get the highest level of First Amendment protection, then what is the consequence of that going to be? And put it together with the concept that First Amendment protection is not absolute, and that the First Amendment doesn't protect you from laws of general applicability, and now add this concept that PR, advertising, and marketing gets a lower level of First Amendment protection. And what does that mean for all of you advertising, PR, marketing people? It means that the government can do what? Regulate it. Can heavily regulate it. And we'll talk about, so this is we had commercial speech is advertising, and then corporate speech is when we take that concept, and get this, what you should write here is, remember the Santa Clara case of 1886. What did the Santa Clara case of 1886 do? It created the idea of corporate personhood. Now remember, that's on the 14th Amendment timeline. Now, here what we see is the court taking that idea and saying, oh, well, if a corporation is a person, and a person has these rights, and a corporation has the same rights as a person, that means they also have First Amendment rights. And this is when they created the idea of corporate speech. So we had corporate personhood in the Santa Clara case on our 14th Amendment timeline, and then it becomes corporate speech on our First Amendment timeline. So now, starting in 78, corporations have the same First Amendment rights as people. You could then even draw a line from this concept that corporations have speech rights all the way to the controversial Citizens United decision of a few years ago. Do you remember that case, what it did? The Supreme Court, with that case, essentially struck down as unconstitutional about 100 years worth of campaign finance law. And the reason is because of this idea. The corporation said, wait a minute, we have corporate speech, we have rights under the First Amendment. Flash forward to 2000 and, what year was that case, 2010? And they argued contributing money to someone's campaign is speech, and therefore the government can't regulate it. So the Supreme Court struck down all those rules, and that's why we had a flood of money, corporate money, into the last election cycle. That's why the presidential campaign, the two campaigns alone spent $2 billion. The corporations won the right not only to have their money not capped, so unlimited corporate spending, but it could also all be anonymous. They didn't even have to say who it was from.
Why did like Olbermann get in trouble then? Isn't that what he did?
Who?
Like Keith Olbermann, like the news guy. Didn't he give a bunch of money to like a Democrat and was fired?
Yeah, or I don't know that he was fired because of it. There was a controversy about that because there are caps. There are limits on how much an individual can give. Now think about that, right? Think about how the Supreme Court tipped the balance in favor of corporations, right? All of those caps remain for individuals. I have a limit in the amount of money that I can give you as a candidate, and you have to even disclose my name. Whereas through the Citizens United decision, the Supreme Court said corporations don't have any limit, and they don't even have to reveal who they are. Right?
So how can, I understand that you're saying the Supreme Court give meaning to the word liberty, because it's a broad word, but speech, like giving money, that doesn't really sound like it's.
I don't think, but see, there again, it's like, okay, remember we had the burning of the flag. They said, yes, that is speech.
Yeah.
Burning a draft card, no, that's not speech. Nudie dancing, no, that's not speech. Well, in a case called Buckley versus Vallejo, that came after this, they said that giving money in a campaign is a form of speech. So are we would you say that we're in an era where the Supreme Court, like in those earlier years we talked about, is favoring corporations over people, or are we living in an era when the Supreme Court is favoring people over corporations? Right, so we've seen that trend over the last 20 years.
But if a corporation is not seen as a person, the people are in the conflict, they can get help from corporations.
Because the Supreme Court decided that. Yeah, just because. They decided it, and you can read a very long and complicated and convoluted decision that they wrote to justify that. It doesn't seem fair, does it? I mean, that, I as an individual, I'm just a schmuck, it's not like I have a lot of money. There's a cap on how much I can give, and the person I give it to must disclose my name that I gave it. And yet the corporation just has free reign. And that's why we saw campaign spending double in the last election cycle, right? So it really just becomes a money contest. Who can outspend the other?
Did any justice write a dissent for that?
Yes, very passionate dissents, multiple dissents written in that case. And I want to say the scathing one, which is actually really an enjoyable read, because he's really venting his spleen, is John Paul Stevens, who's a really great justice. This was before he left the court. And very scathing dissents. Because you talk about, what's that an example of? The Supreme Court, and this is a very extreme example, the Supreme Court used its power of judicial review to strike down as unconstitutional about 100 years worth of campaign finance law. That is an example of
Judicial review.
they used their power of judicial review to do that, and so it's an example of judicial activism. Judicial activism. When they're using their power of judicial review to strike down laws in order, let's even just say it more broadly, to make very rapid changes to the law. Because remember we said that they want to prefer to make the law change slowly over time, but when they make a very dramatic change to the law by striking down laws as unconstitutional, it's judicial activism. That's why, if you do a Google News search, you'll see there was an article, an interview with Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the New York Times last week or the week before, in which she made the observation, this is the most activist court that we've had in decades, right, in terms of their willingness to very radically change the law. Okay, right, commercial speech is y'all. And you can just make a note. This is all you PR, advertising, marketing people, this is your big case. We're going to talk more about this next week, but this is your big case. this, for the first, in Valentine, or your line of cases, this is the commercial speech line of cases. In 1942, the Supreme Court in Valentine v. Christensen said that y'all don't get any protection. Advertising, zero, no protection at all. And they wanted advertising to be regulated. I'm going to go quickly through these because we're going to talk more in depth about this later. But then here's your big landmark decision, the one that protects you. It's like with the journalists, they're all, their big touchstone case is New York Times v. Sullivan, which we're going to talk about. But with all you advertising, PR, marketing people, this is your touchstone case. So the Supreme Court changed its mind in 1976. They overturned Valentine v. Christensen, and they said, no, advertising does get First Amendment protection, though not the highest. And we'll talk more about that next week. And just make a note in your PowerPoint here, Valentine v. Virginia board talked about time, place, and manner regulations, okay? And say, those are, we're going to call those TPM rules. TPM rules, time, place, and manner restraints. Those are laws of general application, and you can say this, time, place, and manner equals TPM rules equals generally applicable laws. They're generally applicable laws, so the First Amendment doesn't protect you from it. And you could say, classic example, parade permits. Like if we wanted to have a parade to celebrate Breast Cancer Awareness Week, we can't just go out in the middle of Montreal Avenue and start marching up and down. We have to apply with the city of High Point for a parade permit, and they have to know when we're going to do it, and they have to get police over here to put up the roadblocks and all like that. And that's okay. That's not abridging our freedom of speech, because that is a TPM rule, a time, place, and manner restraint, where that rule applies to everybody. Anybody who wants to have a parade on a generally applicable law. And TPM rules are generally applicable laws. They apply to everybody. It's like, who's been to a party where the cops show up? Isn't it? Okay. And why did the cops show up? Because of noise. And so the town of High Point has a noise ordinance, and it says things like, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., you cannot have music or noise above such and such decibel level. That's a TPM rule. It's a time, place, and manner constraint, and it doesn't violate your First Amendment rights.
So does that cover, a university? I guess it's different for public universities that are more open and not excluded by noise complaints and stuff.
Yeah, High Point University, because it's a private school, they can set whatever rules they want.
So it doesn't follow the same as
At the very least, High Point's noise ordinance would apply here because some of the streets here are public streets.
Yeah.
Right, like Montlieu, that's a public street.
Yeah.
But these are all private roads in here.
Yeah.
And so in your dorms, for example, High Point could pass much stricter rules than the city regulation. Right. But what the city cannot do, notice this, in the noise ordinance, it cannot say no loud polka music after 10 p.m. Why can't it say that? No, that's the right word. It can't single out certain types of speech, or in this case music, because that would be viewpoint discrimination. And so what we say is, which you might as well take a note right here, because this is going to come up later, TPM rules must be content neutral. TPM rules must be content neutral. Otherwise, they would be viewpoint discrimination. And that's a no-no under the First Amendment. Okay. So next week, we will do our last day on First Amendment, and we'll do the stair-step method. That's probably going to take 2 classes, Monday and Wednesday. And then Friday, we're gonna have we're gonna have an ethical discussion about Edward Snowden and WikiLeaks and that sort of thing. Okay? You guys have a great weekend.
Thank you.